Hi, everyone. My name is Itumeleng Mpofu, and welcome to Break It Down in partnership with News Live SA. So you're probably seeing this on News Live SA YouTube channel. So welcome. My name is Itumeleng Mpofu. We are trying something new here, which is not ordinarily the setup of Break It Down. So I don't really know whether we should actually be calling it Break It Down or give it perhaps a different name. But let us know what you think in the comment section. If you think we should give this a different name, then I think let's see what we can do with it. But I had to set up the recording so that I can just record something quick pertaining to just two things that I wanted to speak about. So the first one is that the incoming president of the United States of America, Donald Trump, posted on X, putting out a tweet about, do you actually still call it a tweet? I'm not sure if we still call it a tweet, but posted on X, speaking about BRICS, saying that countries that are part of BRICS will now attract 100% tariff. So it's not that it's coming into effect, but of course, when someone is an incoming president and they utter such sentiments, you then know that those sentiments are most likely to be policy of that country in the future. So that's one thing I wanted to speak about. The second one is that on my Instagram stories, I had posted that Donald Trump becoming president of the United States of America is not a good thing for South Africa, for the South African economy and Africa in general. So I'll also address that. So to start with the tweet on X. So to start with the tweet on X, the tweet highlights a big problem that Donald Trump has with the idea of BRICS currency. And I think if we want to analyze it and try to understand what exactly he's speaking about, his sentiments come from the typical superiority complex of the United States of America. The US it doesn't matter who the president is. It exists under this cloud of superiority complex where they ought to dictate what happens in other countries and all over the world. Hence, they ought to station their military bases and their military all over the world. And it has been like that since time immemorial. So I like to make an analogy when I describe how countries function in the international system, is that countries behave just like humans do. So countries have friends, they have enemies, there's the cool kids, there's the bullies. The same thing applies when you imagine countries. There's always the cool kids, which are the G7, there's enemies, countries that don't go together, and then there's countries that are allies and friends and all of that phenomena that we see with women, with humans. We also see it when it comes to states. And for a very long time, the United States has served as that bully who's bullying up everyone else in the world. And when a new bloc comes up to challenge that narrative, then it starts to become a problem. So the US is not a country that wants to let go of its power in the international community. And sadly, other countries are rising up due to fast tracking in growth of their economies. Blocs like the BRICS are also coming up, becoming serious powerhouses. So essentially what they're saying is that being a cool kid is not only something that is exclusive to the US and its friends, but it's something that countries around the world can be able to be part of. So Donald Trump has a serious problem with the idea of the BRICS currency. And the bigger problem comes from the fact that it seeks to dump or to become an alternative to the US dollar. Because remember, the US dollar is the main source of trade in the world. When countries are trading, they do it in US dollar. So the US dollar tends to dictate what is it that happens in the world. And with the US dollar being in that position to dictate, it simply means that the US has power over it because the US dollar functions through the US correspondence banks. and you ought to follow certain regulations in order for you to be in possession of the US dollar. So what this does is that it benefits largely the US economy. The circulation of the US dollar is good for the US economy. So when countries speak about dumping the US dollar, it means that they're poking the US. If you look at in 2019, it is said that just over 88% of world trade was done in US dollars. 88%, that's massive. So that means all these trade deals involved in some way or form the use of the US dollar. And in order to be able to use that, you do it through the correspondence banks, which means that there's all sorts of fees and all sorts of transactions that have to be done, right? That is the process that going against that is what would be called the de-dollarization of the international system. So if South Africa wants to do a deal with Swaziland, wants to do a deal with Lesotho, wants to do a deal with Ethiopia, Kenya, they have to do it using the US dollar because the US dollar is that medium of trade. But now, the problem with having the US dollar as that medium of trade is that you put yourself at the risk of possibly being sanctioned. Because when you've been sanctioned in some sanctions, you are no longer allowed to be in possession or to even use the US dollar. And that has been successful if you look at it in the sanctioning of countries like Zimbabwe. So if the US is to sanction small states like that, the system works for them. But if you are to sanction bigger states and much more powerful states like Russia and China, but at the moment we see it with Russia, when you do that, Russia has the capability, financial capability and backing to be able to create alternative systems. And it is using the BRICS to do that in creating an alternative, leading to the idea of the BRICS currency. So the question that we also need to ask ourselves is, how did the US dollar become that powerful currency that it is? And when you look at history, it starts back from the end of the Second World War, where the US was actually the biggest economy and other countries that had been part of the war were in the process of rebuilding their economies. The US dollar was then seen as the most credible currency of that time to trade and to do business. So it was considered to be the most stable of the time. And then in 1944, 44 countries then came together in what is known as the Bretton Woods Conference, where they agreed that they are going to peg their local currencies against the US dollar. And the US dollar itself will be pegged against gold. This means that countries were able to establish the value of their currencies relative to the US dollar. And it meant that trading among these countries can now be done using the US dollar, involving the US, even if the US is not part of the transaction. If you think of it in another language, we say that the US, in this case, is unoxman. Unoxman is that person, emadaisin, who's always getting a portion of your winnings, you know. So that's what the US is in the international community. And this has then led to the 2023 BRICS summit that was held in South Africa, where the BRICS member states then expressed the need for an alternative in what they then call the BRICS currency. Now, the BRICS countries and others will trade using this currency. It is seen as that alternative to the US dollar. If you have the US dollar occupying 88% of trade in 2019, definitely the incoming or the ushering of the BRICS currency will definitely change those dynamics. And when that does, what it does is that mainly it replaces this hegemony or this superiority complex that the US exists in, where the US thinks that they are the top dog and everything has got to be done through their rules and through their ways. It changes that because that means the percentage reduces significantly from 88 to whatever percentage it might be at that time. But what it means is that some of the biggest and rising economies are no longer utilizing the US dollar for trade, meaning that the US dollar is no longer seen as that credible because it is seen as a weapon that can be used at any time by the US to attack these other smaller countries. But this time around, they've poked the wrong bears because they've poked those that are powerful and that are capable of creating these systems that they can bring into place to make sure that they even reduce the risk in future of being sanctioned by the US. Russia suffered a lot when they were sanctioned by the US in terms of their oligarchs and their possessions being taken away and all of that, and also being removed from the SWIFT system, which is a system we use for our card transactions and all of that. It has prompted them for everything to need to have an alternative. And I think this prompted also an idea in my head that has come up long time ago about a unified African currency. You know, that if there are talks about creating a BRICS currency, what about the African continent coming on its own to create its own currency that works in the African continent? Because now every single country has its own currency with others using the US dollar. Why not have our own African currency? Some have tried to bash the argument, but there is the euro. The euro is used in the region of Europe. So you can't tell us that the idea of a unified currency in the modern day era is something that is not possible. It is very much possible. So those are the thoughts I had, and I'm willing to hear in the comment section what everyone else is thinking, because I want this to be more of like a conversation, more of a dialogue. Let's put in the comment section our thoughts. Where you feel that I might be slightly incorrect or incorrect about something, feel free to add in the comment section. Let it be a forum of conversation. I think that's what I'd like this platform to become. Now, the second point I wanted to address is that what does Trump mean for South Africa or for Africa as a whole? Now, the key basis of analyzing that, there are many aspects we can look at, but I think the critical aspect is to look at AGOA, which is African Growth and Opportunity Act. AGOA came in since from the time of 2002, where it allowed certain African countries, certain, not all of them, to export their products to the US at no tariffs, right? So what that meant is that businesses in different countries that qualify to be part of AGOA can then take their products, local domestic products, and go sell them to the US. Now, that on its own has now become a weapon where the US can simply remove any other African country. They find that this country is not following the rules that we put in place. So if a country does not listen to what the US has to say, or a country has a different stance compared to what the US would like the country to have its stance, then the country gets removed. Uganda was recently removed, and a few other countries have been removed. So that happens. That has now become weaponized. And that is the basis at which the partnership of the US and the African continent lies. So AGOA expires in 2025, and it is expected that there will be a review which has been taking place in order to review and decide if it's something that must continue. I've had Ndate Cupcake Cyril Ramaphosa saying that it must be extended for way longer than the 10 years that's normally given, because Africa is here to stay and the US is also here to stay, and that partnership is very important. But we will see if actually it will be renewed. But by the look of things, it doesn't look like it's something that's going to be renewed, because Donald Trump has been very adamant in saying that there must be tariffs for all the goods that come into the US. So far, he had spoken about a 10% tariff on all products coming into the US. And if that happens, that will significantly hurt the African economies. That will hurt all those countries that are benefiting by taking their products to the US. Experts have also said that in the case of South Africa, it is slightly different. The impact will not be as dire, because if that happens, the South African economy will shrink by around 0.06%, which is said that it's not much compared to how the other countries in the African continent are going to suffer. Now, the US is the second biggest trading partner of South Africa after China. Now, what makes this change to not be a big blow is because the products that South Africa is already exporting to the US are products that are largely not covered by AGOA. So we're talking your mineral resources that South Africa has an abundance of. These are the products that enter the US. So they still attract tariffs already. So it is said by experts that it will not be too much of a blow to South Africa, but it will be a blow throughout the African continent. But it could be a problem where even those products that are not covered by AGOA will now attract even higher tariffs, now that it is said that countries that are part of BRICS should attract 100% tariff. So this also shows how the US has never really given respect to Africa and its leaders. And we've had even Donald Trump uttering derogatory comments describing Africa as shithole countries. So that policy position that the US has always taken in its relation to Africa, the only difference is that whoever comes into office will have certain utterances that they have, but in terms of broader policy approach, it has always been the same, and there hasn't been any much changes in terms of showing that Africa has also come to the table. So key thing to note is that Trump is simply delivering his promises to the American people, which is to make America great again. He has told them repeatedly that when he comes into power, he will make America great again. He has started to use tariffs as a weapon to deal with those that do not listen, just to show the mighty power that the US is, or the bully that the US is. He's done the same to Canada. He's done the same to Mexico, where he's told them that their products will attract higher tariffs when they enter the US if they do not deal with the problem of immigration. So that just tells you the thinking of how the US operates. You don't do this, we take from this. You don't do this, we punish you here. So they've always had that mentality of punishing others. And it looks that this is taking a different turn. He's literally putting the American people's needs first, and that's all he's doing. And I think it's high time that African leaders themselves stop waiting for aid and handovers that come from the West and its allies. It's time for African leaders to come together, to unite, and to find and forge a way for the African continent. The sad part is that most of these leaders, they run the African continent like they're running their households. They really do not care for the people. Africans everywhere in the African continent are suffering. We know of the wars that are taking place. We know of the ills, corruption, and all sorts of things that are taking place in the African continent. And we hope that one day the African people will also see the responsibility to rise and fight for themselves. Because there's no one else in the world that you can wait for and hope that they will come and be the Messiah to liberate the African continent. The African continent is dependent on its own people, its own resources, its young population that we have. That's our strength, and that's what should be used to our fullest capability. So I'm hoping that we can have more of this conversation in the comment section. If there's anything you'd like to add in the comment and we can engage. Otherwise, my name is Itumeleng Mpofu. You can find me on all social media platforms where I continue these conversations. And thank you very much to News Live SA for this opportunity. Thank you so much. Peace. I've always wanted to press these buttons, so I think this is an opportunity.